Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our final session for the afternoon. Our next speaker is an anarchist libertarian philosopher. He has written certainly one book that's been published so far, Escape from Leviathan, which is a hardcore anarcho-libertarian treatise, and due in publication is his forthcoming Dictionary of Anti-Politics. Our next speaker is an anarchist. When most people think of anarchists, they tend to think of ideological fanatics with wild, staring eyes, bent on the overthrow and destruction of the state. Failing to dispel any of these myths, can I welcome Dr. Jan Lesser.
Thank you. When he was still alive, I sent an earlier version of this paper to Karl Popper himself, and Karl kindly promised to reply to my arguments. Sadly, before he could reply, he became very ill and subsequently died. I later included a version of this paper in my book on Libertarianism, and I sent that book to Robert Nozick, as I really thought he needed to understand Libertarianism properly, and critical rationalism, and how they relate to each other. Sadly, before he could reply, he became very ill and subsequently died. Now, I'm not an inductivist. Some of you might be about to find out, but I shall be sending copies of my next book to every member of Parliament. In this talk, I'm going to explain very briefly critical rationalism. That's partly because I think I know what it is, though David Miller, who is Karl Popper's rabbi on earth, often assures me that I don't, and points things out to me that I've got wrong. And therefore, I can only assume that other people are probably even more confused than I am. So I'll briefly explain critical rationalism, then critical rationalist libertarianism, and then in slightly more detail, why critical rationalism fits libertarianism better than it fits Popper's preferred liberal democracy. So, critical rationalism. Popper was originally interested in the demarcation between science and non-science. It cannot be true that scientific theories are epistemologically verified or justified, the general term he preferred to cover all types of foundationalism. Because such universal, hence infinite theories could never be supported by a finite amount of evidence, even if all that evidence were unproblematically true, or rather accurate. Thus, there is no solution to David Hume's restatement of the epistemological problem of induction. Induction as an epistemology is a myth, just as was its original logical form in Aristotle, as the supposed inverse of deduction. The popular insistence that there is some form of induction or justification nevertheless is often a mere futile attempt to refute a philosophically argued conclusion with common sense. But Popper noticed a crucial asymmetry. The falsification of universal theories is logically possible. We just need one counter-instance. All swans are white cannot be verified by any finite number of positive instances of white swans. It can be falsified by one instance of a non-white swan, as this supposedly well-supported theory eventually was falsified by the discovery of black swans in Australia. So, methodologically, we can make a virtue of producing bold universal conjectures that we do not pretend are ultimately supported by the evidence in any way, and then test these conjectures as severely as we can, both by observation and criticism. We can happily admit that, in principle, we might be mistaken about any theory, regardless of the amount of testing. This became known as falsificationism. Implications of this view. There is no reason to think that we are in fact mistaken about any particular theory unless we find an apparently good counter-instance or criticism of it. So skepticism must be maintained in the sense that knowledge is always uncertain, but not in the sense that knowledge is impossible. We often possess theories that are true. A trivial example would be if I asserted X and you assert that not X, then logically one of us must have a true theory. Metaphysical theories are merely empirically unfalsifiable, but they may be true. And all scientific theories have metaphysical presuppositions as consequences. Apparently single observations are both theory-laden and have infinitely many consequences, including hypothetical ones. If I were to hit the chairman with this glass of water, then this glass of water would break, and I would never be invited back. But that is never going to be tested. Thus, single observations are also in the situation of not being verifiable, though Popper himself sometimes writes of the confirmation of unproblematic single instances. This view is not to deny that probabilities exist, but only to imply that they do so within the framework of what are ultimately mere conjectures. Critical rationalism is both descriptive and prescriptive. It describes what we have to be doing science at all, conjecturing and testing, but it also prescribes how to do science better, bolder conjectures, more rigorous tests. Critics sometimes suggest that falsificationism is not falsifiable, and so fails by its own standards. It is true that it is not empirically falsifiable, though it is criticisable. But an epistemological theory is not supposed to be a scientific theory. Philosophy is not science. Some critics also object that one cannot conclusively verify a counter-instance either. So falsification is also impossible. Alternatively, that if falsification is possible, then to falsify a universal theory just is to verify its negation, so that some verification is possible too. However, it is part of falsificationism that a justified falsification is not possible. Putative falsifications are themselves conjectures that remain open to testing, though we can only test one thing at a time, and all tests assume much. The point is that we could not, in principle, we could, in principle, observe a single counter instance of a universal theory. We could see a black swan, having been told that all swans are white. We could not, in principle, see all swans at every time, at every place, being white. So as a falsification is at least possible, we are entitled to conjecture that we have discovered a falsification if we cannot seem to refute it. But we never leave the realm of conjecture. Partly thanks to the critical work of other philosophers than Popper, this falsificationist epistemology has been extended to logic, mathematics, morals, and every other area of knowledge, and has become known as critical rationalism. Outside the empirical sciences, the method is about actively and unceasingly seeking criticism with the rejection of any kind of epistemological foundations. Even in logic and mathematics, a valid proof has no more force than its assumptions. Assumptions or conjectures are all we have to go on in every area of knowledge. All that said, it is possibly pedantic to eschew all justificationist expressions in everyday speech, especially arguing for, which David Miller tells me I should never say. It would be like refusing to mention sunrise or sunset because it contradicts heliocentricity. It is sufficient that one understands and makes plain that a theory can ultimately remain only a conjecture, and that such arguments are can only properly elaborate the consequences of or apparent evidence about a theory, which is useful for understanding it and stimulating criticism of it. In fact, many alleged justifications are really just such explanations and elaborations. Perhaps there is at least one non-foundationalist usage of justification that critical rationalists can consistently use. This is simply the sense that some thesis has been squared with the apparent facts and any criticisms. In other words, the thesis appears to be without problems. But this is not to say that it is positively supported in any way, or that it will remain apparently justified even in this sense. If critical rationalism is thought not exactly right, then seeing which theories withstand critical scrutiny can still be accepted pragmatically as a useful way to deal with theories, even by justificationists who cannot agree about which theories are justified and how. This practical point is not to minimise the theoretical differences. The classical view of knowledge is of justified, true belief. Critical rationalism denies that justification is possible, observes that most important scientific theories will not in fact be true, and holds that belief is irrelevant. Thus, the critical rationalist view of knowledge has been humorously explained as unjustified, untrue unbelief. Now, critical rationalist libertarianism. Many, probably most, libertarians think they need some form of justification or foundation or support for their ideology. Various attempts have been tried, including autonomy, contractarianism, natural law, utilitarianism, and of course empirical evidence. Although one can subscribe to or simply use any of these to defend or to criticise libertarianism without also being a justificationist. There is an explicit non-justificationist alternative, critical rationalist libertarianism. If someone asks a critical rationalist libertarian to justify his views, he would probably decline on the grounds that he thinks is impossible. He does not adhere to libertarianism on any basis whatsoever. Like all theories, it is ultimately a mere conjecture. All one can do with a conjecture is to test it against the evidence and intellectual criticism, both of which must involve conjectures that themselves always remain open to testing. Thus, the only reasonable policy is to look for the best tests or criticisms available. If it comes to convincing a critic, then one can only answer his specific criticisms as far as possible. Even if this were eventually done to the satisfaction of a critic, it remains just as much an unjustified conjecture as before. It simply wastes time to attempt a futile justification when one will have to answer the specific criticisms of all comers anyway. Yet one can usefully think up criticisms for oneself and attempt to answer those. Now, how do critical rationalist libertarians disagree with Popper? Now, the title of this talk is A Libertarian Critique of Popper, and indeed, in some sense it is, because it's a critique of Popper's politics from a libertarian point of view. But in another sense, it's more of an exposition of the critical rationalism and how it fits together with libertarianism. What is my thesis? It is not that radical experimentation by the state, rather than liberal democracy, is more in accord with the spirit and logic of Popper's revolutionary epistemology. It is the opposite criticism, that full anarchic libertarianism, individual liberty and the free market without any state interference better fits Popper's epistemology and scientific method. I think this thesis is important because I accept Popper's epistemology and methodology, and I think these are useful as part of the defence of libertarianism, the value of complete liberty as a bold conjecture that withstands criticism rather than a theory to be supported. And in its turn, libertarianism is a useful part of the defence of Popper's epistemology and methodology. It illustrates their beneficial social applications. In one sense, Popper's picture of the best way to pursue truth is only a part of the more general picture of libertarianism. Popper advocates what can be called intellectual libertarianism. I'm here suggesting that this libertarianism should be extended to the realm of individual persons and businesses and voluntary organisations. Popper writes that he seeks to put the finishing touches to Kant's own critical philosophy. I seek to put the finishing touches to Popper's own social philosophy. Popper sees that people never rule themselves in any concrete, practical sense. His understanding of democracy is not ruled by the people, but a way of limiting bad rule, ultimately in order to preserve maximum equal freedom, or so he asserts. From a libertarian point of view, liberal democracy is a practical contradiction, at least to the extent that liberal means having respect for interpersonal liberty. The more liberty individuals have, the less they can be ruled by the people or anyone else. A liberal democracy is a sort of substitute for all-out civil war. The winning side imposes its rules on the others by force and the threat of force. The taxation and regulation of people who are not imposing on anyone are themselves forms of aggressive imposition rather than peaceful persuasion. Popper insists that any kind of freedom is clearly impossible unless it is guaranteed by the state. The possibility of competing private police and courts protecting persons and their property and of anarchic defence is put beyond rational consideration by Popper. He writes that the question, who should rule, begs for an authoritarian answer. Libertarians can disagree. Each should rule himself, a sovereign individual. This is a coherent and non-authoritarian answer. Popper prefers to ask, how can we organise our political institution so that bad or incompetent rulers cannot do too much damage? But this clearly does presuppose the necessity for political authority over subjects. The very possibility of individual sovereignty, rather than institutional control of the rulers, is also thereby eliminated without ever having been raised. I'm interested here in only what I call actually existing democracy, rather than in some impossible ideal, just as people used to refer to actually existing socialism, meaning regimes calling themselves socialist rather than some impossible ideal of socialism. I mention this because Popper often explicitly sees some very unfortunate state of affairs with what he calls democracy, but he fails to see that it is practically intrinsic to liberal democracy. In fact, he goes so far as to assert, quote, "It is quite wrong to blame democracy for the political shortcomings of a democratic state. We should rather blame ourselves, that is to say, the citizens of a democratic state," unquote. For Popper, democracy itself is apparently put beyond rational criticism. He does explicitly argue against the free market and in favour of what he calls protectionism by the state to defend freedom and welfare, for example. And a comprehensive response to Popper would have to include a close analysis of such arguments, which I'm not going to do. What I'm going to do now is list 14 similarities and dissimilarities between critical rationalism and libertarianism and the liberal democratic politics, so we can see whether they fit or whether they don't fit. So, with critical rationalism, no one has the authority to establish whether a theory is true or imposes theories on others. In a libertarian system, no one has the authority to establish whether a product or practice is desirable or to impose his products or his practice onto others. But with the state has the authority to establish and impose what it sees as desirable products and practices, and as we know, it often does so. 2, we can be optimistic about attaining the truth via free competition among theories. Under a situation of liberty, we can be optimistic about attaining utility via free competition among products and practices. But political intervention is due to pessimism about achieving utility via free competition among products and practices. Scientists perceive their individual problems. In liberty, persons and businesses perceive their individual problems. But with politics, governments claim to perceive collective problems for the country, nation, society, economy, public interest. All of these invariably being euphemisms which disguise sinister interests. 4, scientists specialise in problems, not subjects with conventional boundaries. In liberty, persons and business specialise in their particular problems. But politicians do not specialise, they are generalists. If they have any specialist skills at all, maybe it's only in sophistry. 5. Scientists seek interesting and substantial truths. In liberty, persons and businesses seek valuable and substantial practices and products. But in politics, in liberal democratic politics, politics seek mainly to gain votes by whatever means they can. With critical rationalism, scientists do and should conjecture as boldly as they can. In liberty, persons and businesses also do conjecture as boldly as they can about how to improve their businesses or their circumstances. But politicians are not bold. They are usually considered cautious, small policy variations. Extremism will lose more votes than it gains. Paternalism will not exist under critical rationalism. Scientists can not be interfered with on the grounds that they may do themselves any damage, or we don't want to allow people to experiment or in this way or consider that particular theory. In liberty, paternalism or special interests cannot impose or restrict individuals in their experimentations in lifestyles or whatever businesses they choose to run. But paternalism is part of a liberal democracy. Special interests often impose or restrict individual and business conjectures and experimentation, or ban them. Error elimination is required. So scientists should seek falsification, not ad hoc defences. With individuals and businesses, error elimination is also required. Falsification is obvious because we have lower profits or less satisfaction, and coerced subsidies are not normally possible. But with politics, error is often unclear to politicians, except possibly in terms of lost votes. So they have a tendency to deny any errors and subsidise any mistakes. After error elimination, there is a new scientific problem situation. After error elimination, there is a new personal or business situation. But with politics, there is no clear problem situation, except possibly that politicians have to subsidise more or buy more votes from somewhere somehow. And this requires, in science, a new scientific theory. In society, it requires new practices and new products. But politicians usually seek a short-term botch without a clear theory. Hence, testing is difficult. The general social picture, we're now up to 11, the general social picture is of peaceful polycentric competition among scientists about their theories. The general social picture with libertarianism is of peaceful polycentric competition among individuals and businesses about their products and their practices. But the general social picture with politics is ipso facto of aggressively imposed commands. That's what politics is about. If it didn't exist, you wouldn't have any politics. This is against holistic experimentation in science. It's impossible to understand and test with so many variables, and therefore you have to try and isolate things. In society, liberty also ensures individualism in understanding and testing personal or business problems. But politics is typically holistic in just the way that Popper says we shouldn't be, about understanding and testing problems. And Popper's solution to this, so-called piecemeal engineering, is also his expression, is simply authoritarian rather than totalitarian. 13. This is against the historicist theory that social sciences make long-term prophecies. Libertarianism views unique individuals and the market catallaxy as unpredictable in the long term. But politicians often have historicist theories to defend. Sometimes change is supposed to be inevitable, or sometimes traditions are supposed to be unshakable or unchangeable. And therefore these things are imposed on everybody else. So finally, this is against the historicist theory that universal social scientific technology is impossible. Popperian view of science. In society, libertarianism embraces the universal social scientific technology, especially that of microeconomics. But politicians often belittle social scientific advice, especially that from anti-political microeconomics. Why does Popper not see that libertarianism is a better social application of his epistemology and methodology? I suggest 3 possible contributory factors. First, Popper came to his political position from a socialist one and retained some sympathy for socialism. 2, he made no serious study of economics. He simply swallowed many popular anti-market prejudices, despite the fact that Hayek's pro-market views must have had some good influence upon him. And 3, Popper thinks, quote, absolute freedom is impossible, unquote. Instead, following Kant, the liberal principle, quote, the liberal principle demands that the limitations to the freedom of each should be minimized and equalized as much as possible, unquote. As 3 is the philosophical factor, I shall focus on that. It is probably Popper's anti-essentialism that has caused him to avoid any explicit formulation of a theory of liberty that can be applied. But if we say, as I do, that a free person is someone who is not being proactively imposed upon by others, withholding a benefit, defending oneself, or enforcing a contract is not proactively imposing, then it is possible to have a group of people who are absolutely free with respect to each other. And by such a conception of freedom, it follows that state interference with non-invasive activities will be an assault on freedom. When Popper was writing The Open Society and Its Enemies, he was contrasting the workings of liberal democracies, such as Britain and the United States, with totalitarian regimes, the kind with which they were at war. He considered the book to be his war effort. By such a contrast, liberal democracies are certainly more conducive to individual freedom and welfare, and I do not intend to contradict the general thesis which Popper was defending. But even if I were to agree with Winston Churchill, whom Popper quotes, that democracy is the worst form of government, apart from any other, I should wish to add that private property anarchy is not as bad as democracy. Hegel's principle of subjective freedom, that free speech alone allows people, quote, quoting Popper here, an irrelevant opportunity to give vent to their feelings, unquote, seems quite realistic from a libertarian point of view. Popper's view that this is cynicism, that the ordinary man is substantially free simply because he can speak his mind about politics, is quite inadequate. The illusion that a liberal democracy constitutes a so-called free society is partially sustained by this trick, which Popper perpetuates instead of taking liberty seriously. At the end of the addenda of the Open Society and Its Enemies, Popper states that fallibilism, quote, can show that the role of thought is to carry out revolutions by means of critical debates rather than by means of violence and warfare. This is why our Western civilization is an essentially pluralistic one, unquote. But what is politics finally backed up by, if not aggressive violence? And what could be more pluralistic than respecting individual sovereignty instead? And this, liberal democracy does not do. I conclude then that, contra many Popperians and many libertarians, critical rationalism and libertarianism is a marriage made in reason. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. And just to remind you that if you want to explore those ideas a lot further, Jan's book that explores this a lot further, Escape from Leviathan, Jan tells me that it's the book that Robert Nozick would have written if only he were a little bit cleverer and better read. Do we have any questions from the audience at all? Brian Micklethwaite was the first one.
It's not really a question, and I'll therefore be very brief. Just to say, I have a similar opinion about rules. I like the idea of the veil of ignorance as a way of comparing different worlds. My conclusions are libertarian, unlike his.
Just to comment on your comment, yes, I absolutely agree. Rawls says we are to assume that people in the veil of ignorance are, whilst they know nothing about themselves, they have personal amnesia, they have complete knowledge of the social sciences. Well, if they do that, then they'll understand economics and they'll understand that the market's going to give people more liberty and more welfare.
This lady here.
Lily Tannant. You said that Popper thought that democracy is beyond the scope of rational criticism. Isn't it, I mean, that sounds very un-Popperian, so I'm wondering whether it's not just that he thought that democracy was the best idea we have so far.
I don't think he took criticisms of democracy seriously. That's the problem. When he's discussing liberal democracy, he says, well, obviously, we can't have freedom unless the state guarantees it in some way. It's just obvious, and therefore I'm going to move on there. So, in that sense, it didn't even occur to him. Now, he must have heard of anarchy under some form. I don't know whether he ever heard of libertarianism, but I mean, if he did hear it, he decided it's beneath contempt or not worth taking seriously. Either that or it didn't even occur to him. In that sense, he just puts it to one side.
Chris Mancy.
Thank you. You talked all about democracy. I was just wondering if in Popper's world there was, technically speaking, a good version of democracy. What version of democracy did he actually address?
Obviously, we don't have democracy in this society. We have elected oligarchy, and because that's what the oligarchs want, but they call it democracy because it helps to legitimate what they do. Had he thought about it, I don't think he really did. Popper would have said the same thing. We don't really want democracy at all. It's an appalling idea that, you know, everybody can have a vote, and then that becomes the rule that we have to abide by. He wanted some kind of elite to rule. But for him, he says democracy means the system by which we can limit bad rule. So he would have probably liked the idea that at least if we can throw the rascals out at a general election, that counts for something. But he doesn't really go into different versions of democracy and what they might mean and how they might work. He's not very interested. He just thinks that we've got to have a state and we've got to limit the damage that it can do by some kind of appeal to the populace.
Richard Wellings.
Not naming names, certain well-known Austrian economists are very anti-Popper. Could you explain whether Austrian praxeology is compatible with critical rationalism?
Yeah. I'm inclined to say that critical rationalism is compatible with Austrianism, but maybe Austrianism isn't compatible with critical rationalism. Obviously, if it depends on your interpretation of Austrianism, whether you think that these things are beyond any doubt whatsoever, your conclusions are apodeictic and certain. Now, a lot of Austrians will say that. They will say this is as certain as mathematics and logic. But then Popper has undermined mathematics and logic and said, well, it all rests on assumptions. Now, we don't have any reason to doubt an assumption unless somebody comes along, but then you do get people like Euler in mathematics who come along and say, right, here's this long list of mathematical proofs. What could be more certain than mathematics? They're all wrong, and he showed why they were all wrong. Now, that isn't to say we're going to overthrow certain basic assumptions in logic, but you never know what you might have overlooked, and you never know what argument might show something later on. Now, if Austrians are prepared to concede just that much, I mean, they can have an awful lot of psychological certainty and say we have really, we've looked at all the criticisms, we've got absolutely no reason to doubt it, and if they're prepared to accept that much fallibilism, Austrianism can be compatible with critical rationalism. And I'm actually quite sympathetic to Austrianism, but it's just if they say, no, we're absolutely right, it can't be doubted, you just read the proof again, and don't bother criticising it because it's certain in its own right, then it's incompatible. So it just depends on the Austrian.
It's the Austrian insistence on apodictic certainty that's the crux. Ben Cousins first, and then Tom.
Just a few historical remarks about when and where Popper was born, and why, honestly, I'm not sure that it wouldn't be proper to make allowances. Austria sort of means, freedom, libertarianism, and so on. Austria-Hungary, they're not a terribly illiberal empire, was pretty authoritarian. The successor state, Austria, was ruled by a combination of succession of socialists and Catholic authoritarians. Britain, when Popper was here, was a pretty socialistic country. New Zealand, actually, was a very, very socialistic country indeed, pretty well right through the 20th century. Cultures went along with these structures, and frankly, with all his intellectual industry, Karl Popper could not take on everything at once. I don't think it's disrespecting the man. I think it explains a bit, simply to take these historical factors into account, that's all.
I don't defer to many people in my respect for Popper, because part of critical rationalism is you criticise your friends and heroes, and you allow your enemies to carry on making mistakes. There are plenty of excuses. You can't do everything. Like most people in philosophy, or like many people in philosophy, he has one major insight, and then he tries to apply it to everything, and he makes some mistakes. So I don't think. If we have to put people into the good camp and the bad camp, he's well into the good camp, and I make a lot of excuses for him. Yeah.
Tom Burrows first.
I suppose that actually in some ways that Ben is kind of partly headed me off at the pass with his comment, but one of the reasons I'd like to ask the question as to why Popper was as sceptical about the arguments for sort of free enterprise as he was, because if you think about it, well, and I'm sure you would know this as better than I do, that the process of entrepreneurship is a form of economic conjecture and refutation process. Profit and bankruptcy, and when a company goes bust, is a classic example of how a business idea is falsified. And ironically, the current government attempts to prevent firms from going bust is a classic attempt by governments to stop the healthy falsification process happening to an economy. So, it's often, I think it was said by George Gilder, that the problem with socialism is epistemologically it's dead, because you don't ever learn anything, because you never allow failure to occur in business. And I'm surprised that Popper didn't quite pick this point up, the advantage of the parallel between his approach to science and the way that business in a free market operates is that it allows failure, and it allows you to hopefully learn from failure. In a way, it's kind of like an obvious point, I think, but I was kind of surprised that he was so sort of resistant to that, or at least he was so not aware that that was one of the sort of real big benefits of a free enterprise system, is that it's a kind of an ongoing process of testing ideas out.
Yeah, I was a critical rationalist before I was a libertarian, and when I read Libertarianism, I was immediately struck by how well this fitted critical rationalism. And I just thought, my best, I mean, if you're going to point to a cause, I mean, there are all sorts of things, you know, what caused the room to set on fire? Was it the match? Was it the oxygen? Was it the petrol? Was it the maniac? I mean, you can point to all sorts of things. It could be an absence rather than a presence. But I mean, I'm partly inclined to point the finger at Hayek and say he didn't do his job properly. I mean, he understood economics and he talked to Popper and corresponded with him, and he didn't explain to him that, you know, really the free market fits his epistemology so much better. This is possibly because Hayek, to some extent, has his own epistemology, which was in competition with Popper's, that he wasn't motivated to do that. But again, that's just a conjecture.
David Goldstone.
Yeah,
The microphone there, David.
what are the implications of critical rationalism for the way that you would say libertarians ought to go about their job of arguing?
Well, as I mentioned here, but I'm very happy to repeat, you meet somebody and you have a disagreement, it's absolutely pointless to say, I will give you an explanation as to why libertarianism has to be the right system. Once you get to the end of your long explanation, they're going to pick on one or two things which for them are the key issues, and they're the things that you have to reply to. So you may as well just say, well, I don't think government is necessary at all, it doesn't do any good. What do you think? And then they will tell you, and then, you know, now, they may be very economically savvy in the economic calculation argument, or they may be civil libertarians who have issues about, you know, people shouldn't be allowed to take drugs, or they shouldn't be allowed to take drugs, whatever. Or you never know what people are, what for them are going to be the sticking point. But for many people, of course, it's welfare. And so you simply go through the welfare arguments, and they say, well, if charity really were better than the welfare state, and you can convince them of that, they say, well, that's it, that's my criticism gone then. But horses for courses.
Lady here, and then Toby.
Lily Tannet. What do you think is the main mistake that most libertarians make from not taking Popper seriously? Or a mistake?
If you're not a critical rationalist, to some extent it will make you dogmatic. And that means you will give people short shrift and you will dismiss them as being irrational or bigoted or whatever, when in actual fact these people probably, you know, they can be persuaded to argue with you. It makes you tolerant of disagreement. That, you know, you can start from anywhere. Politically, I started as a communist. I was 16, I was in the Communist Party. It didn't take me long to argue myself out of that. But the very fact that I was arguing is what led me out of it. So, tolerance of criticism, and then, as I said, focusing on the particular criticisms of the particular people, rather than simply saying, here it is, this is what you must understand, just read the tract, don't answer back. This is like a proof that you have to understand. It isn't like a proof.
Tony Brown.
The last lecture I heard on Popper was something over 30 years ago by Sir Isaiah Berlin. And both Berlin and Popper, in presenting their analysis, were resting upon the traditional concept of the left-right split, with communism at the left end and fascism at the right end, and sort of the line with liberal democracy somewhere in the middle. And as I listened to you, what particularly struck me was that actually what they needed to get beyond some of the criticisms which are implicit in what you said was they need to move towards the structure which we are now all familiar with, which is the one set out in the world's smallest political quiz, The Advocates of Self-Government by American Libertarians and so on, where you have two separate axes, one of personal issues and the other of economic issues, and you end up in that kind of analysis with Stalin and Hitler right next to one another, in total contrast to the belief in a combination of social liberty and economic liberty, which is the libertarian corner or quarter of the graph. So isn't the point about Popper and a lot of the people of the time was that they actually hadn't yet developed and weren't talking in terms of the analytical structure which moves us beyond the sort of oversimplified and now anachronistic left-right split that was used to analyse politics 30, 40 years ago.
In its original sense, the left-right split is okay for us. In the French Assembly, laissez-faire on the left, and the Royalists, the Tatistes on the right, we could stick to that. Confusion had come in thanks to the Fabians taking conservative ideas and making them out to be, labelling them as left-wing. There's an awful lot of confusion involved. I don't think, I mean, I've written on this political compass idea myself, and it is useful, a way of explaining to somebody, you know, how libertarianism fits against totalitarianism or fascism, where all the different parts fit. But the real problem with Popper, and notoriously with Isaiah Berlin, is they just didn't take the idea of liberty seriously. Popper didn't do it because of his anti-essentialist views. He said you should never ask what is questions. So, because there was, you should deal with real problems. And I disagree with him here. I mean, there is a problem where there's something that libertarianism, or the liberty that libertarianism is talking about, you know, the sense of non-interference, what it means not to interfere with people, what counts as interference and what doesn't, that needs to be clarified and explicated. Berlin, with his two concepts of liberty, just muddied the water completely, and Popper just didn't even think about it. So, but you had two people talking about a subject about which I'm afraid their opinions were no better than the man on the streets, though they had other areas of expertise.
Brian, make your point again.
It's a long time since I've read Popper, so apologies if I'm just wrong, but didn't one of his books have the title Utopia in it? And isn't that perhaps what he didn't like about libertarianism? Maybe. He certainly wrote about millenarian views of perfectible society and saw in that as an enemy of what he described colloquially as liberty.
It vaguely comes to mind in Conjectures and Refutations. There may be a chapter that mentions utopia. This is a long... Yeah. And that probably, if he would be something he might bring up as a reason why he would be against libertarianism, but then it depends on how you interpret it. I mean, I don't think libertarians are utopian in the sort of traditional sense that, you know, here is some kind of an ideal society, and this is how it's going to be constructed, and this is how everybody's going to live. Rather, libertarianism, rightly understood, says, look, politics is an evil that needs to be minimised, and to ask you know, well, what will you put in the place of politics? It's a bit like asking, well, if you get rid of cancer, what do you put in the place of cancer? You don't put anything in its place. You just get rid of it. Then you're still going to have a lot of problems. Nobody's going to say that life is going to be wonderful from then on, but you've got rid of something that is definitely a problem. I don't see that as utopian in the sense that he would object to, and which most people mean.
Just to ask Chair. Sorry, you come back, Ryan.
Oh, sorry, very briefly. I agree with you that libertarianism isn't utopian in that sense, but it is a very widespread opinion, and I think, and I'm sure you're right that he didn't spend a lot of time thinking about this, and that was the kind of casual thought process that may have influenced it. That's what happened.
Just to ask a Chairman's question, one of the things it's clear from Popper's philosophy and from what you said in your talk is that justification or support for or foundations for any kind of theory or idea, including the idea of libertarianism, is not only valueless but impossible. Now, a lot of libertarian philosophers, in fact the majority of them, spend an awful lot of time devoted to finding justifications for, foundations for, or support for libertarianism. In fact, they seem to sort of, whenever you read a book on libertarian philosophy, the first sort of 6 chapters seem to be taken up with an effort at justificationism, one or another, and there seems to be a lot of competition between libertarians to find ever more tighter and more secure forms of justification, and Hans Hermann Hoppe, a guest here last year, prides himself on having coming up with the ultimate justification, which anybody dissents from must be psychologically damaged. He seems to. Now, are all these philosophers coming up with justifications, all these libertarian philosophers, simply wasting their time, or is there anything useful that can be gleaned from their efforts at justification, or should they just simply get on and answer their critiques?
Insofar as these things are supposed to actually offer epistemological support, they're wasting their time. However, a lot of things which are put forward as justifications are better seen as explanations. To explain something is not to justify it. So, you know, they say, well, society works in this way, this way, and this way, but under libertarianism, things would fall out in this way. You know, that would happen, this would, so many things would follow. Now, that's often a very useful thing to say, but it doesn't justify the system, it just explains it. But many, contractarianism, for instance. Jan Arneson is a contractarian, and he thinks you can show that libertarianism must be the system by looking at contractarianism. I read contractarianism, and I think it actually shows, that there's a certain amount of fairness in this system given certain. I read it as an explanation of how libertarianism can be seen to be fair and just, rather than as an explanation which, if you read it, that's it, case closed.
The lady there, first of all, and then...
Just following on from that, do you think that what libertarians put forward, that are sort of called justifications for libertarianism, are actually maybe an attempt to falsify the certainties of people who argue in favor of democracy or socialism? Opponents of libertarianism.
So you're saying are just justification attempts to falsify alternatives?
Yeah, or to break what appears to be a sort of political consensus.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, given that epistemological justification doesn't exist, that doesn't mean that everything that's called as a justification is a waste of time. They're just doing something different from what they think they're really doing. And so the economic calculation argument, for instance, is a refutation of socialism, because you have to have money as a numeraire, or there's no known alternative anyway. Now, in a sense, it's not actually a logical refutation of socialism, but it poses very, very clearly a big problem. It doesn't follow that then that I would say that you've justified anything, because that you might have made a mistake, but it certainly looks like, as it stands, a refutation of socialism as a moneyless society.
The gentleman just there.
Some minarchists say that the libertarian theory of a society of free individuals engaged in free exchange was falsificated by the history because the states evolved and the groups of powerful people grabbed the power and evolved into the states. And that's why they say that sort of small states should be preserved to prevent this evolution going further.
You're saying small states are a way of stopping large states from growing?
No, small in range of activities. Just a basic state. Rule and order.
A basic state, it has advantages or?
It has advantages over libertarian because history told that groups grab power and evolve into states, very oppressive states.
So your view is that if we
have a minimal state is better than anarcho-libertarianism because
they say
because the mechanisms of the power
because they protect, you can protect yourself as a minimal state.
No, because the history showed that we started with free individuals and suddenly the groups grabbed power and evolved into states. So some people say that we should prevent this situation. We shouldn't let full anarchism. It's better to have minimal state with guarantees of liberty.
Well, yeah, if the minimal state did guarantee the liberty and were safer, I might be inclined to agree. I mean, here you're getting into sort of the most difficult area of libertarianism, which is, do you need something like national defence? I'm inclined to doubt it. Afghanistan was mentioned earlier. I mean, the USSR and Britain and the USA have all failed to conquer and rule Afghanistan. If that's impossible, then I mean, I don't see why you need to have a state in order to protect you, given the amount of money it's going to take and the rules it's almost inevitably going to impose. It's you create such a danger by having a state in the first place. All power corrupts, and the people at the top have got the power, and it's almost inevitably going to grow. But I think it's probably safer to risk being invaded, though I think the risk is exaggerated, than to set up a state and have the certainty of the taxation and the regulation that it's creating what you're trying to avoid. That's what it looks like to me. That's the danger.
Just the two last questions. There's lady here first, and then Richard Garner. So the lady here.
Popper wasn't just against the idea of constructing and implementing a perfect society. He was against any kind of political change. So I would just like to know, as a Popperian anarchist, how you feel about the question of piecemeal change versus a revolutionary overthrow of the state.
Yeah. I think that it wasn't working, was it? Yeah, Popper said it's very, very dangerous, looking at the Soviet Union, whatever, to have this kind of revolutionary change. You can't isolate and test individuals. You turn something into a disaster. And he said, okay, that clearly doesn't work. Therefore, he says, it follows from my epistemology, you have piecemeal social engineering. So the government does something like just ban alcohol or something. You know, it picks on something and says, well, we do a bit of this, we try a bit of that. And he thought that this was a liberal alternative. But these aren't liberal alternatives. These are all authoritarian alternatives, because they're imposing things on people who are minding their own business. In most of the examples that he might regard as piecemeal social engineering. Of course, he could also say deregulating this and then see what happens. That's also piecemeal social engineering, in which case, obviously, libertarians would be in favour of it. But the general picture is that governments ought to be allowed to tinker in this, that, and the other area to see whether they can make things better. The very idea of government intervention is going to be authoritarian. So it can't fit libertarianism, but it doesn't fit the idea of people conducting their own experiments with their own lives and deciding what they think is best for themselves.
And Richard Garner.
Is this one? I was just wondering whether, what you mean by justificationism, and what Karl counters as justification. It seems to me that one of these justificationist libertarian strawman could, if they were to challenge the idea of morality as a reason for action, they could say, I have this argument that ends in a conclusion that basically says, and justice requires X. Now they could say, I'm not saying that X should be the case, all I'm saying is that justice requires X. And X is libertarianism. In that, and it seems to me that your views on justificationism seem to presume morality provides a reason for action.
Well, I hadn't mentioned morality. You're saying my views presume that morality provides a reason for action?
Yeah,
I would say yes, it does. I mean, if something's morally good, that's the reason to do it. If it's morally bad, that's the reason not to do it. So, but you're saying that such an argument is a justification?
I'm saying somebody could say this is what justice means. This is what justice is about.
Yeah.
This is what, and it happens to be about libertarianism. But they could say, but it might not necessarily be the case that society should say be just. What I'm saying is this is what justice is.
You seem to be, your position is somebody can have an argument that this is the just thing to do,
yeah.
But I'm not saying that you should necessarily do it.
Yeah.
This is really a point about in morals. We're getting to moral theory now. I'm presuming that you're meaning justice not in a pure legalistic de facto sense, but in what I can only call a moral sense. And it would be very odd to say this is the just thing to do, but you shouldn't do it. That strikes me as inconsistent once you unpack the terms. But I can't say any more than that on that particular topic.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jan Lester, a radical anti-authoritarian in everything except his sex life, he tells me. But please give him a big hand, thanks.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Jan. Just